The crystal chandelier hummed above us, casting sharp, jagged shadows across the sterling silver. During New Year's dinner, my mother-in-law threw red wine in my face. My sister-in-law laughed, saying, "Thanks, Mom. Maybe that'll teach her some respect." Filthy pig. I felt my hands grip the chair. I stood up and made one phone call. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The liquid felt like warm, sticky blood as it dripped onto my silk collar. My husband, David, just kept eating his steak. I walked toward the foyer, my heels clicking like a countdown on the marble floor. My fingers were steady as I dialed Miller. He answered on the first ring, his voice a sharp blade in the quiet hall. I told him to execute the liquidation of every Montgomery asset held under the Apex umbrella. It was a cold, surgical command. No emotion leaked through my voice. I could hear the muffled laughter from the dining room behind me. They thought I was crying in the bathroom. The transition was instant. 10 minutes later, Patricia's phone began to chime with frantic alerts. She ignored the first 3. But the fourth was a direct call from her bank manager. I watched from the shadows of the arched doorway. Her face transformed from a mask of aristocratic smugness to a pale, trembling sheet. The jewelry she wore was technically mine now. The house itself was a line item on my balance sheet. She looked at the screen and let out a strangled, breathless gasp. David finally noticed the shift in the room's oxygen. He reached for his mother's hand, but she pulled away, staring at me with sudden, feral terror. I stepped back into the light, the wine stains on my face looking like war paint. I told them the party was over. Not just the dinner, but their entire existence of unearned luxury. My sister-in-law's laughter died in her throat as her own husband sent a text about their frozen accounts. The silence was louder than the earlier insults. "You can't do this," Patricia whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. I simply smiled and pulled a printed eviction notice from my clutch. It was dated for the following morning at 8 sharp. I explained that Apex Holdings had purchased their primary debt 6 months ago. I had been waiting for a reason to be merciful. They had just poured that mercy onto the floor with the merlot. David stood up, but he looked small and frail against the backdrop of my rising power. I turned toward the heavy oak doors without waiting for a reply. The cold January air hit my face, washing away the smell of fermented grapes and old money. My driver was already waiting at the curb with the engine idling. I didn't look back at the windows of the mansion. Tomorrow, a crew would arrive to change the locks and catalog the inventory. As the car pulled away, I realized the wine had actually been a gift. It finally gave me permission to be the monster they feared. The sedan moved through the slushy city streets while I scrubbed the dried wine from my neck. My phone buzzed with a frantic text from David. He was begging me to stop the madness before his mother had a stroke. I ignored the screen and watched the passing streetlights flicker like dying stars. My objective was simple. I had to reach the office before the banks opened. One loose thread could ruin the entire financial collapse. Inside the glass lobby, the security guard tipped his hat. He knew me as the quiet investor who worked late. He did not see the stained blouse or the fire in my eyes. I hit the button for the top floor. The elevator rose in a heavy silence that pressed against my ears. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Everything depended on a signature I had left in my desk drawer weeks ago. I pushed into my suite and flipped the lights. The office smelled of expensive leather and cold air. I pulled the file from the mahogany drawer and checked the primary clause. Suddenly, the door swung open behind me. It was David. Looking disheveled and desperate. He must have followed my car from the estate. His face was flushed with a mixture of anger and genuine shock. He finally realized his wife was a ghost in his house. "Anna, you have to talk to me," he shouted. I didn't look up from the documents on my desk. I told him he should have spoken up when his mother attacked me. His silence at the dinner table had cost him his inheritance. He walked closer, his shadow falling over the paperwork. He reached for the pen in my hand. I pulled back and looked him in the eye. He saw a stranger where a wife used to be. He tried to plead with me, using memories of our wedding. I reminded him that those memories were built on a foundation of his mother's cruelty. He claimed he didn't know about the debts. I laughed because his ignorance was a choice he made every single day. He grabbed my wrist. His grip tighter than it had ever been. I didn't flinch. I just looked at the security camera in the corner. He realized he was being watched. I pulled my arm away and signed the final page. The document authorized the immediate transfer of the Montgomery Tower to my primary holding company. David slumped into a chair, defeated by a piece of paper. He asked what I would do with the building. I told him I might turn it into a shelter for displaced families. It was a poetic end for a man who valued walls more than people. He stared at the floor. The sun began to rise over the skyline, painting the room in pale gold. I handed David a copy of the divorce papers. He took them with trembling fingers. I told him to leave before the police arrived to escort him out. He walked to the door and paused for a moment. He asked if I ever truly loved him. I told him that I loved the man I thought he was. Then I saw his secret wedding ring. The golden sunlight hit the diamond on David's hand as he clutched the office doorframe. It was a secondary ring. A hidden band I had never seen before today. My skin crawled at the sight of the gold. It matched the intricate pattern on the Montgomery family crest. I stood my ground as he took a ragged step toward me. My objective was simple. I had to get him out before the private security team arrived. David looked at the desk, his eyes darting between the divorce papers and the tower deed. He claimed that the hidden ring was a family heirloom from his late grandfather. I didn't believe a single word that spilled from his mouth. He was a man built of shadows and convenient omissions. I told him to put the ring on the desk and walk away. He laughed, a dry sound that lacked any real warmth or humor. Suddenly, my desk phone rang, piercing the heavy tension in the air. It was Miller, calling from the lobby with a frantic update. The sister-in-law, Jessica, was currently downstairs with a local news crew. She was screaming about a hostile takeover and elder abuse. My heart skipped a beat as I checked the monitor. This was a public relations nightmare I hadn't fully anticipated. Jessica was playing the victim card for the entire city. I turned back to David, who was now smiling with a newfound confidence. He thought his sister's desperate move would force me to negotiate the debt. I reached into my drawer and pulled out a small digital recorder. I played the audio from the dinner party for him to hear. The sound of the wine splashing and Jessica's laughter filled the room. The recording was clear and damning. David's smile vanished as the slur echoed. I told him that the media would love to hear how the Montgomerys treat their family. I would release the audio the moment Jessica gave her first interview. He reached for the recorder, but I moved it out of his reach. He was trapped between his family's pride and their public survival. He took a deep breath and smoothed his messy hair. He looked at the window and then back at my steady, cold eyes. He agreed to take Jessica away if I promised not to leak the file. I nodded once. A silent contract between two enemies. He grabbed the divorce papers and walked toward the exit without another word. I watched him leave, feeling a strange void where my anger used to live. He was a coward to the very end. I sat down and exhaled. The room felt larger now that his heavy presence was finally gone. I leaned back and watched the news crew pack up their gear on the sidewalk below. Miller walked into the office a few minutes later with a grim expression. He handed me a tablet showing a series of new, unauthorized bank transfers. Someone had accessed my private offshore account during the confrontation. It wasn't Patricia or David who had the codes. I realized then that my own assistant was missing from her desk. I stared at the empty chair where my assistant, Sarah, usually sat with her polite smile. My objective shifted instantly to containment of the digital breach. I pulled the keyboard toward me, my fingers flying over the keys to lock my remaining accounts. The screen glowed with a cold, blue light as I traced the routing numbers. The money was moving toward a shell company based in the Cayman Islands. Sarah had been my shadow for 3 years. The pressure mounted as the server slowed to a crawl. I realized Sarah had installed a hardware bypass directly into the mainframe. I knelt under the desk, searching for the physical kill switch. My hands shook as I brushed past dusty wires and cold metal. Every second that passed meant another $100,000 vanished into the void. This was a professional heist, not a family feud. I found the black box glowing with a soft, rhythmic light. I yanked the wire, and the screens went black in a sharp blink. Silence flooded the office like cold water. Miller stood by the door, his face ashen as he watched me. I told him to track Sarah's last known location using the building's keycard logs. He tapped on his tablet, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. Then he stopped. A new detail emerged that shifted my entire world. Sarah wasn't working alone or for herself. The log showed Sarah had left the building with David's sister, Jessica, an hour ago. They were not enemies. They were partners in this grand theft. I realized the news crew had been a diversion to keep me busy while the accounts were drained. Jessica wasn't just a spoiled brat with a mean streak. She was the one who had recruited my inner circle. My breathing hitched as the betrayal sank into my weary chest. I stood up and grabbed my coat from the leather rack. I needed to find them before they reached the airport or a private dock. I told Miller to alert the Port Authority and freeze the shell company's local assets. He nodded and began barking orders into his phone. We ran for the elevator, the metal cage descending with agonizing slowness. I watched the floor numbers tick down. My jaw was set in a hard, angry line. The lobby was a blur of marble and frantic activity as we burst outside. The cold wind bit at my face, clearing the last of the wine scent away. I saw a black SUV idling across the street with tinted windows. Sarah was in the driver's seat, looking straight at me through the glass. She didn't look afraid or guilty. She looked like she had finally won the game. She tapped her watch and smiled a chilling, quiet smile. Before I could move, the SUV accelerated and vanished into the heavy morning traffic. I reached for my phone, but a new notification stopped me cold. It was an email from David, sent from a burner account. He hadn't left for the estate, he was waiting at my home. The message was short and lacked any of his usual cowardice. He told me that he had the physical backup drives. He wanted to trade them for the tower. I raced toward my apartment with Miller, trailing closely behind me in a second car. The morning sun felt like a spotlight on my failure to secure the inner circle. My objective was to reclaim the physical backup drives before David could wipe them. These drives contained the encrypted keys to my entire financial empire. Without them, the shell company transfers would become permanent and untraceable. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. David was playing a game he didn't understand. The lobby of my building was eerily quiet when I burst through the heavy glass doors. The doorman gave me a worried look, but said nothing as I sprinted for the elevator. My heart hammered against my ribs with every rising floor. I reached the penthouse and found the door slightly ajar. The scent of David's expensive cologne hung heavy in the foyer. I pushed the door open slowly, expecting an ambush. Instead, I found David sitting calmly at my kitchen island. He was holding a small silver drive between his thumb and forefinger. A laptop was open in front of him, its screen filled with scrolling green code. He told me that Jessica and Sarah had already reached the safe house. The power balance shifted as he explained their plan to frame me for embezzlement. He had spent years watching me work and had learned more than I realized. He wasn't the weak coward I saw at dinner. He was a patient, calculating predator. You underestimated us because you wanted to feel superior, David said with a cold, flat voice. I looked at the drive, and then at the tactical bag on the floor. He wanted the tower deed in exchange for the encryption keys. I told him that the tower was already legally tied to a public trust. He didn't care about the legality. He wanted the physical occupancy to house his own server farm. He was building a shadow network right under my nose. I moved toward the island. But he tapped a key on the laptop. A warning light flashed red on the screen, signaling a countdown to a total wipe. The pressure became unbearable as the seconds ticked away. I had to choose between my fortune and my pride. I reached into my coat and pulled out the signed deed. His eyes lit up with a greedy, familiar fire. He reached for the paper. But I pulled it back at the last second. I noticed a small, black wire running from the laptop to a device hidden under the counter. It was a signal jammer, but it was also a remote detonator for a small thermite charge. He wasn't just planning to wipe the data. He was going to burn the evidence. I realized he intended to kill me in a staged kitchen fire. The realization chilled my blood more than the wine ever had. He was willing to commit murder for the Montgomery name. Suddenly, the fire alarm began to blare, and the overhead sprinklers erupted in a freezing, heavy spray. Water drenched the laptop and David, shorting out the circuitry in a burst of blue sparks. Miller had triggered the system from the basement to save me. David screamed as the silver drive slipped from his wet fingers and skittered across the floor. I dove for the drive, but my hand hit something else. There was a second, identical drive taped under the table. The cold sprinkler water soaked my hair, stinging my eyes as I gripped the second drive. David scrambled through the puddles, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the wet tile. My objective was to secure both devices and exit the penthouse before the thermite charge ignited. The smell of ozone and wet carpet filled the air. I shoved the taped drive into my pocket and pivoted toward the foyer. David lunged at my waist, his face a mask of desperate fury. We crashed against the marble island with a bone, jarring thud. The laptop on the counter hissed as the internal components shorted out from the flood. David gasped for air, his fingers clawing at my jacket to find the hidden drive. I used his momentum to shove him back into the spray. He slipped again, his head narrowly missing the sharp edge of the stone counter. The pressure was rising, because I could see a faint orange glow beneath the island. The thermite charge was starting to smolder despite the water. I had less than 60 seconds to move. The room felt like a sinking ship. I kicked the silver drive toward the hall to keep it away from David's reach. He groaned and reached for a heavy crystal vase on the sideboard. I didn't wait for him to swing the glass. I grabbed the soaked deed from the floor and bolted for the front door. My lungs burned with the effort of breathing the thick, metallic air. I reached the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The electronic lock had malfunctioned in the deluge. I was trapped inside my own home with a man who wanted me dead. David stood up slowly, the crystal vase held high like a jagged club. He told me that Jessica had the master override code on her phone. He wasn't trapped. He was waiting for her to arrive and finish the job. My blood turned to ice as I realized I had been lured into a cage. The power balance shifted again as he dropped the vase. It shattered near my feet, sending shards of light across the wet floor. He pulled a heavy brass key from his pocket. It was the manual override for the penthouse. "You really thought I was the weak link," he whispered over the roar of the sprinklers. I watched him approach, his eyes fixed on the drive in my pocket. He didn't want the tower deed anymore. He wanted the encryption keys to vanish in the fire. If the keys burned, my fortune stayed in the Cayman accounts forever. He would be rich, and I would be a penniless widow in a charred room. I looked at the brass key in his hand. It was my only way out. I prepared to fight for my life. I faked a move to the left and drove my shoulder into his chest. He staggered back, the brass key flying from his wet palm. It skittered across the floor and vanished down the floor vent. We both froze, staring at the small metal grate near the kitchen. The turn was absolute. Neither of us had a way out now. The orange glow beneath the island grew brighter and more intense. The thermite was melting through the subfloor. Heat began to radiate through the soles of my shoes. We were both going to burn. "The key is gone," I shouted over the blaring fire alarm. David looked at the vent and then back at the door with wide eyes. He started pounding on the wood, screaming for someone to help him. His transition from predator to prey was pathetic to witness. I knelt by the vent and reached my fingers into the narrow gap. The metal was already hot to the touch. I could feel the key resting on a ledge just inches away. My skin bubbled as I strained to reach the cold brass. I pulled it free. I stood up and shoved the key into the deadbolt with trembling hands. The lock turned with a heavy, satisfying thud. I threw the door open and stumbled into the hallway just as the island exploded. A wave of heat and black smoke rolled over me, knocking me to the ground. I crawled toward the elevator, clutching both drives to my chest. I looked back and saw David standing in the doorway, coughing violently. He reached out a hand, but the smoke swallowed him whole. I hit the down button and waited. The elevator doors opened, and Miller pulled me inside with a panicked expression. He told me the authorities were downstairs and the news crew was filming the smoke. I handed him the drives and told him to get them to the secure server. My face was scorched, and my clothes were ruined, but I was finally free. Then Miller pointed to my jacket pocket. A small, red light was blinking on the drive I had taken from under the table. It wasn't just a backup. It was a GPS tracker. Jessica was already in the building. The elevator lurched downward as the blinking red light on the drive mocked my escape. Miller shoved me against the back wall, shielded by his own bulk. My objective was simple: reach the ground floor and hand the drives to the waiting federal agents. I knew Jessica was close, likely blocking the main exit with her hired muscle. The scent of burnt hair and melted plastic clung to my skin like a second layer. I gripped the drives until my knuckles turned white. We were falling through a metal throat. The car stopped abruptly on the 4th floor, the doors sliding open with a soft hiss. Jessica stood there alone, holding a silenced pistol leveled directly at my chest. She wasn't laughing anymore. The high society mask had shattered into 1,000 sharp, cold pieces. She stepped inside the small space, forcing Miller to raise his hands in a silent surrender. The pressure in the elevator became a physical weight. She demanded the encryption keys in exchange for our lives. I felt the vibration of the building's fire alarm. "Hand them over, you filthy little thief," she whispered. Her voice was a jagged razor against the silence of the shaft. I looked at the pistol, and then at the blinking GPS light in my palm. The turn came when I realized she was trembling under her expensive wool coat. She wasn't a professional assassin. She was a desperate woman losing her grip. I told her that the police already had the audio from the dinner party. Her eyes widened, and the barrel of the gun dipped just an inch. I took a gamble and tossed the blinking drive toward the open doorway. Jessica instinctively lunged for it, her greed overriding her tactical training. I slammed my fist into the emergency close button with everything I had left. The doors pinched shut, catching her sleeve for a terrifying second before she pulled back. We began to descend again, leaving her screaming in the 4th floor lobby. Miller let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. My heart was a drum in a hollow chest. We moved. We burst into the main lobby and were met by a wall of flashing blue lights. Federal agents moved in, surrounding us with a precision that made the Montgomerys look like amateurs. I handed the primary drives to the lead officer, a woman with iron, gray hair. She confirmed the digital signatures and nodded once. My empire was secure, and the evidence against Jessica was now in official hands. I felt the first wave of true relief wash over me. The adrenaline began to fade into a dull ache. I looked through the glass doors at the gathering crowd of reporters and curious onlookers. Patricia was there, standing behind the police line, her face a crumpled map of social ruin. She saw me and tried to scream, but the officers held her back with firm hands. She had lost her house, her son, and now her daughter's freedom. I didn't feel the triumph I expected. I only felt a profound, heavy sense of exhaustion. The wine stains on my shirt had finally dried into dark, ugly patches. David was wheeled out of the building on a gurney, oxygen masking his pale face. He looked at me as they moved him toward a waiting ambulance. There was no hatred in his eyes now, only a hollow, haunting emptiness. He had lost the game he never should have started playing. I turned away, refusing to give him the comfort of a final look. Our marriage was a charred ruin in the sky. I walked toward the black government car, waiting at the curb. Inside the vehicle, Miller handed me a bottle of water and a clean towel. He told me that Sarah had been apprehended at the airport an hour ago. She had already started talking to the prosecutors to save her own skin. The entire conspiracy was unraveling faster than the Montgomery name could be scrubbed from the city. I leaned my head against the cool leather seat and closed my eyes. The war was over, but the silence felt incredibly loud. I was finally alone. The car moved away from the chaos, heading toward a safe house on the coast. I pulled the second wedding ring from my pocket. The one I took from David's office. I looked at the family crest engraved on the gold surface. It was a symbol of a legacy built on arrogance and hollow pride. I rolled down the window and tossed the ring into the dark, rushing river. It vanished without a splash, swallowed by the cold water. I was done with their secrets and their heavy gold. As we reached the city limits, my phone chimed with a final, encrypted message. It wasn't from a lawyer or a banker. It was an automated alert from my home security system back at the penthouse. Someone had accessed the hidden wall safe behind the library shelves while the fire raged. I had never told David or Jessica about that specific safe. It contained the original physical copies of my true identity documents. I realized then that my father, the man who disowned me, was still alive. Image of a bank vault door. The car sped toward the coast, as the alert on my phone glowed like an ember. My father had disowned me years ago for refusing to be a social ornament. Now, he was raiding my scorched ruins while the Montgomerys burned. My objective was to intercept him before he reached the border with my true identity papers. Miller watched me, his eyes reflecting the passing highway lights. The pressure was a physical weight in my chest. I felt like a hunted ghost in my own skin. I ordered the driver to turn back toward the city's private airfield. My father always traveled by air when he wanted to vanish. The obstacle was time, and it was running out fast. I clutched the remaining encryption drive in my pocket. If he took my birth documents, he could claim my entire estate through a dormant family trust. The power balance shifted as I realized he wasn't just stealing papers. He was trying to erase the very existence of Anna Harrison. We reached the hangar, just as a small jet began to taxi. The sound of the engines drowned out the wind. I jumped from the car before it fully stopped. A tall man stood near the boarding stairs, his back to me. He held a small, charred briefcase I recognized from my library. I called his name, and he turned slowly. It wasn't my father. It was Patricia's personal lawyer, holding a power of attorney. My mind raced to connect the dots. The lawyer looked at me with a cold, professional pity. He explained that my father had sold my secrets to the Montgomerys months ago. They had used my own history to build a legal trap. I wasn't just fighting a family, I was fighting a legacy. I reached for the briefcase, but he stepped back toward the stairs. He told me that the documents were already scanned and uploaded to a secure cloud. The physical papers were just a distraction for me. I realized the wine at dinner hadn't been an outburst. It was a signal to start the digital transfer of my identity. The Montgomerys were willing to lose their house to gain my entire life. I stood on the tarmac, breathing in the smell of jet fuel. The lawyer boarded the plane, and the doors sealed shut. I had stopped David and Jessica, but the elder Montgomerys played a much longer game. I looked at Miller, who was now holding his own phone. The cloud servers are located in a jurisdiction we can't touch, Miller whispered. My victory felt hollow and cold in the morning light. The jet took off, soaring into the gray sky. I had the money and the tower, but I no longer had a legal name. I was a woman with millions of dollars and zero proof of who I was. I looked down at my hands. They were still stained with the dark, dried red of the wine.